welcome everyone. A number of other people still joining us, and some people will get automatically linked into the YouTube connection. But let's go ahead. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Ryan Owens to everyone. Ryan is on the faculty at UW-Madison, political science, and he's got an appointment with the law school as well. He did his undergraduate work at UW and also got a law degree from Wisconsin. And his PhD he earned at Washington University, St. Louis. And he, after practicing law, he did the faculty thing and started out at Harvard. And Wisconsin hired him away from Harvard. So he went from the Harvard that's cut on the East Coast to the Harvard of the Midwest. So not a bad kind of move. Importantly, Ryan is the founding director of the Thompson Center on Public Leadership. It's a new center on campus that has been really offering a real rich variety of programs, public policy programs and the like. Ryan's specialty in terms of his research, his scholarly research, and his teaching is law and the courts and American politics. And he's going to talk to us today, as you all know, about the future of the Republican Party. The last thing that I will share about Ryan is that he very proudly places on his CV the fact that he's a co-owner of the Green Bay Packers, along with 310,000 other people.
Yeah, that's right. All my closest friends.
Yeah, right. So we're all we all have our fingers crossed, Ryan. Hope the Pack does well this Sunday and gets into the Super Bowl. So right. With that, take it away.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate being here. I hope everybody is doing well. And I suspect that many of you could see one of my 3 dogs kind of walking around in the background here as we started. I'm not sure what we have in store for us from the canines in my household, but hopefully they'll be on their best behavior. At any rate, I'm happy to be here and to talk about kind of where we are politically right now. I think a lot of people can tell that we're at a point in time where the Republican Party is, being pulled in many different directions. There are different factions within it that have always been a little bit uneasy in their relationships with one another, whether it's evangelicals with more libertarian elements of the party and sort of traditional conservatives, as we can see from Russell Kirk's readings. It's been a party that's had a lot of divergent ideological interests over time. And I think if 2016 showed us anything, it was that the party was ripe for picking from somebody who could come in and articulate something that might appeal to different elements within the party, but pull it in different directions that it might not be interested in going. So I think Republicans find themselves right now at a point in time where it's unclear, at a broad level, where they are going to head. Now, I want to be clear up front that I'm not going to articulate any position about which way the party should go or ought to go. I think it's important at this point for us just to kind of identify some of the major factions within that party. And so I put out 3 readings for today that I thought people could look into. The first is one by Russell Kirk, and this is a more of a traditional conservative approach. It is, as we'll talk about a little bit more, it's about incrementalism. It's about respect for institutions. It's about sort of a long-term connection between the past, present, and future, and where humans reside within that long continuum. And that's very different, I think, from the Flight 93 reading that we had today, which I think is if you take Kirk as kind of what conservatism is, I think the Flight 93 reading is very much the opposite of that. It is not an incremental approach. It is not a kind of protect institutions approach, but precisely the opposite. And so it shouldn't be surprising that there is a lot of tumult in the Republican Party, because what it means to be conservative has sort of been stretched in those two different directions. And then, of course, we have the third reading for the day, which is Ronald Reagan's A Time for Choosing, which is the speech that people often point to as really kind of setting him apart in terms of leading a movement among the conservative spectrum there. And that's, it's a mixture of kind of a muscular foreign policy with a moral view of the world, combined with a slightly more libertarian perspective when it comes certainly to the economy and the individual's relationship with the government. And so I see these as three of the most dominant factions within the party right now. And rather than sort of figure which one has the best argument or which one is likely to win, maybe we just start off and we talk a little bit about what those perspectives are. So that's where I'd like to go with this. I'd like this to be a very conversational approach, a dialogue here where folks can ask questions about the readings. We can start off with Kirk, but just kind of try to figure out what it is that Kirk is trying to argue here. What are his main points about conservatism and what it means? So I guess, Terry, do we have questions from folks about that?
Not yet. I think everybody's just absorbing what you're saying with it. One question I have with that, though, among the three, is there a demographic breakdown? For example, you're a young guy. Is there going to be younger Republicans going to find one of those three more comfortable, older, find one the other, women, others? Do you see any kind of demographic breakdown in terms of those three approaches for particularly younger Republicans?
It's a good question. It's difficult to say because people when they find their political identity, you could say, it's oftentimes in the context of where they find themselves, right? And if you find yourself in the Republican Party right now with Trump as at least the titular head at the moment, you tend to see everything through the eyes of that. Having said that, there are a number of students that I teach who find themselves to be more of the Reagan Republicans than Trump Republicans. So I think it's too early to say yet. I think we need to see what happens within the party, what happens with who steps forward and tries to take the mantle of the party. I think there are many voters in the Republican Party who are ripe for persuasion from them.
One question has popped up here. It says that it seems that Kirk appeals to the mind, Reagan to the heart, Flight 93 to the gut. Other differences might be more of style, and I can't imagine any of them embracing Black Lives Matter. There's a question and a statement.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good way of examining this. Kirk to the mind, Reagan to the heart, and Flight 93 to the gut. And to the gut, I think, is an accurate representation because there's a lot of reactionary dynamic to that Flight 93 reading. It's let me kind of move my pages up to this. You can look at some of the language used here. So on page 1485 of the text that I sent out to people, 2016 is the Flight 93 election. Charge the cockpit or you die. Right? It's very, very emotional, very sort of reactionary. Other language on page 1487, we are headed off a cliff. I think that's right. It's appealing to the gut. Now, that's not to minimize some of the positions that this person has taken, right? Whether you agree with them or not, you can see that much of what he's advocating for here is rooted in a grievance that he sees as being sort of foisted on them by the left and by, I think, what he would say are like sort of turncoat conservatives over the years. But I do think that there's an element to that. Kirk is definitely, I think, of the three, the one who appeals most to rationality. His is a very Burkean approach. Let's take a look at institutions. We have to protect them. We have to keep them. It's a very strong respect for existing infrastructure, and we don't see that elsewhere. We've seen this in other writers as well. So if people are interested, you can go back and you can read Abraham Lincoln in his Lyceum address. And Lincoln talks quite clearly about the importance of institutions. Institutions are what keep us from losing our rationality at times, and that if we don't have a proper respect for institutions, law and order completely falls apart. And I think Kirk fits within that quite well.
And the last part of that question is, they seem to be more of a style rather than substance.
Well, there definitely are style differences between the two. There's no question about that. But there are absolutely clear substantive differences among these authors. I think, Kirk would not support much. I mean, I don't want to put too many words in his mouth, but I suspect that Kirk would not support at least some of the Trump agenda. Certainly, we know that Reagan would not. We can't get a whole lot of it from the text of his speech, but Reagan was very strongly pro-immigration. And so I think he would find himself at odds with Trump on that. Smaller government, free trade. So he would find himself at odds with Trump there as well. There are definitely stylistic differences. Reagan was inherently an optimist, and you don't get much optimism out of the Flight 93 approach. I also think that, Russell Kirk, maybe slightly optimistic. I mean, his optimism comes in the long-term value of institutions and the fact that we have wisdom handed down from generation to generation. So, his optimism can be found in sort of the long game. Reagan, in that respect, is a little bit, kind of the odd man out, because his approach is, from the individual perspective, very optimistic. He's a strong believer in individual capacity, individual reason, and so somewhat interestingly, I think he sets himself a bit apart from conservatives like Burke, conservatives like Kirk, who talk about the inherent fallibility of man, so to speak.
Do you think the Lincoln Project is a Kirk? Are they Kirkians?
No, I don't think so. They're an odd mixture of maybe some Kirkians, some, I don't know, neoconservatives, neoliberals. They're an odd mix of a broad range of people. So I don't know where I would put them.
We got a note here that someone says, as a professional woman in 2021, nothing Kurt had to say had any resonance with me. As I was reading about his reverence for institutions and incremental change, I envisioned hearing it delivered by a character like by Charles Lawton in a 1930s movie. Awful, corpulent, gout-ridden, aristocratic, oozing contempt for the masses from every pore, and upholding concepts like empire and property ownerships to the exclusion of actually the individual rights. So think about that one for a minute. You want me to read any of it back?
No, I mean, I think I get the gist of it. Is, sort of what can Kirk, how much relevance does Kirk have for us today? And I think, I think there's quite a bit, actually. I'm not going to defend Kirk, but I am going to try to talk about where he situates in this. I think Kirk would say that actually the changes that the audience member wants to see happen are certainly well within the institutions that we've created themselves. That we all have the benefit of living in a society today that is freer than any society in the history of the world. And yes, we can make changes and ought to make changes, but you have to appreciate the fact that you can't just burn everything to the ground and start over when you want to. I think that would be Kirk's approach, is that yes, you can build change, but do it incrementally in a way that builds upon the values, builds upon the successes of the past. I think it was Kirk who talked about how we're dwarves standing on the shoulder of giants. And I think his point would be that, look, take these institutions that we have, build on them, improve them where we can, but it's sort of a folly of human, hubris that we can just always know what's right at every moment in time and not respect some of the decisions and the wisdom of the past. I think that would be his response to that question. That doesn't make it the correct response, but I think that would be his response.
Question wondering, where do you put Scott Walker and the ALEC approach to governing in these three?
Yeah, I think Walker would be more along the Reagan side of the spectrum, probably. The funny thing is we live in a world right now where few people want to advocate for the incremental analysis of a Kirk. We're accustomed to wanting change and getting it now. We're accustomed to going and ordering food and having it instantly. And I think people have little patience for waiting. And to some degree, you can understand why that's the case. But the fact of the matter is I think there are not that many people who are articulating a Kirkian view of politics any longer. It's about what you can get to your base and how quickly. And that's not to say that's right or wrong. It is simply to say that it's not a particularly Kirkian or Edmund Burkean type approach. We're more likely to see that kind of thinking in the courts today than we are anywhere else. So given that, I think Walker is probably more along the lines of a Reagan than a Trump. But there's arguments to be made there as well.
And you referenced this, but somebody wants you to go a little bit further. What does the Republican Party do with the fact-resistant and violent element that we've seen in some of the things in the past week? What happens with that for the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, I think that officials need to be quite clear that lawlessness is unacceptable, just across the board. Lawlessness is unacceptable. If Republicans are going to talk about the virtue of stability in law and order, I think they have to walk the walk. I think we all have to walk the walk on this. I'm not going to both sides, these things to too much degree, I think, but clearly what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years or so is that elements on the radical side of both the left and the right have learned from one another's tactics. And so, I think we saw political violence, we saw violence in the streets, lawlessness over the course of the summer that got a lot of attention. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of people on the far right, or not even necessarily the far right, but just some of the crazies that are out there, saw that and said, that's a strategy that we can employ. And then they employed it. And now I think the other side is likely to take the same thing. And this is very destructive. It's very destructive. If we do believe in conservatism, sort of writ large in terms of respect for institutions, then what you need to do is not trash those institutions. You need to talk about the value of those institutions. And if you have problems with them, right, where is the outlet? The outlet is changing the people who are in charge of those institutions, rather than burning them to the ground. And I think that's kind of where we've lost things recently. So I think we need to articulate a clear message across the board. I think Republican leadership needs to articulate a clear message across the board that, this kind of behavior is completely intolerable.
Here's a question. Would any of the three factions embrace the principles, if not necessarily the rhetoric, behind Black Lives Matter? None of the three writers addressed racism and white privilege.
Yeah, so I think there are, it's interesting. I had students read the Black Lives Matter platform in the class that I taught this fall, and I'm not sure that any of them previously had read it. And it was surprising how many students said a number of different things. A handful of them said, wow, this is really a radical document. And it's true. Some of the things that are advocated for in that document are incredibly radical. But there are other things in there, and we talked about this in class. There are other aspects in there that I think conservatives can actually get on board with. And I'll point to two things in particular. There is an element in there that wants to, an element of logic in the platform that talks about the importance of more local control. Now, it's sort of framed through the lens of race in the Black Lives Matter platform. But it's sort of talking about how we need more local control over some of these institutions, including police. But the feature there, the location of local control, is something that I think traditional conservatives could certainly sympathize with and say, you know what, we've been advocating for this for years. We're on board with that. Local control is better. People on the ground know each other better. They know the situation better. They have trust built up with one another. And if they don't have that built up yet, they need to get there. So I think that's one element where conservatives could see eye to eye with the Black Lives Matter movement on that. The other is the notion of criminal justice reform. There are many conservatives and Republicans across the country who, for the last 4 to 8 years, have been strongly advocating for reforms in the criminal justice system. We've seen them in deeply red states like Texas, Tennessee, and elsewhere, as well as deeply blue states. Sometimes the rationale to getting there is different, of course. But I think there is a growing consensus among conservatives and Republicans that the system that we have right now, or some of the methods we're using, are not working as well as they could. You go to the American Conservative Union's website, and they've got a number of principles that they advocate for criminal justice. And they say there's absolutely no reason why people should come out of the criminal justice system worse off than they were when they went in. That doesn't support notions of individual dignity that they like. The religious elements within the Republican Party support that as well. Those who believe in fiscal responsibility are certainly turning towards criminal justice reform right now and saying, look, we're spending $35,000 to $50,000 a year to house inmates in prisons for offenses that weren't dangerous. And that seems to be a waste of money. And not only that, they're coming out maybe more radicalized they were when they're going in. They don't have skills when they come out to get jobs, so they recidivate. They're not in the tax base, and now we're actually supporting them in prisons longer and longer. This is just a bad use of taxpayer money. So we're seeing I think a conflagration there among conservatives and Republicans. And if we could all sort of tamp down the rhetoric a little bit on politics in general, I really strongly believe there's a way that we can accomplish, bipartisan criminal justice reform. I think it's there waiting for the taking. It just needs the right messenger, I think, to get people together. So I do think that certainly the Kirk analysis and absolutely the Reagan analysis would see some space there in conjunction with Black Lives Matter. But once you get past some of those areas, I think that agreement probably disappears.
Okay, that catches us up now. If you want to continue with that catches up with the questions right now. If you want to continue more on your other presentation.
Gotcha. Yep. So let's see here. So we talked a little bit about style, and I guess one of the questions that I'd like to ask people is, what is it precisely that Flight 93 author, what is it that he wants, right? So he talks about three areas. Immigration is one. I think he talks a little bit about culture and society, a little bit in assimilation. But what is it that he wants to see here? It's not altogether clear. I think people can read this and go different ways. But I guess that's one question I'd like to toss out there is, what is it that he wants to see that he's not seeing right now?
We have any takers? We have no takers on that. We have a couple of others, but I don't want to throw you off from what you're doing with it.
No, that's fine. We can go in a different direction too. If there's another question out there, I want to be responsive to the audience.
Can you name some Republicans who you think are in favor of institutional reform or Kirkian approach?
That's a very good question. More of the Kirkian approach. I think there's an element of this in Ben Sass in some of his arguments, potentially Mitt Romney. I think that these are. It's interesting. Ben Sass is often talked about as one of the more moderate Republicans, but when you look at his voting record, he's actually quite conservative. I think the reason he's often seen to be a moderate Republican is the fact that his demeanor is very sort of humble. He's friendly, cordial, and he often talks about respect for institutions, which shouldn't be a huge surprise. I believe he was a history professor for some time before he got into politics. So I'd say Sass is probably somebody who's a little bbit more Kirkian. It's strange because some people are like that with some of their moves and less like that with others of their moves. Think about a guy like Mitch McConnell. Where would we put him? Well, on the one hand, he seems to be somebody who's very kind of incremental in his approach to policy. On the other hand, this is the same person who sort of blew up the filibuster and also kind of pulled back on the blue slips a little bit. So institutionally, he's been okay with kind of pulling back on some of those procedural limitations. So it's unclear where you put a guy like him. And that's I think that's one of the things that certainly students often talk about when we go through these readings, is that the labels of conservatives and liberals or Republicans and Democrats change so much over time that certainly what it meant to be a conservative in the 80s under Reagan was so very different from what it means to be called a conservative today with Trump as the head of the party. It's just these things change. Just as the same could be said, of course, too, for liberals who, under John F. Kennedy pursued tax cuts and a muscular foreign policy. And today, I think you could say the opposite is true of them as well. So the evolution of this is very interesting. There's a real neat article by two guys who used to be at Washington University in St. Louis, Gary Miller and Norman Schofield. And they're formal modelers, but they had this really neat conception of politics and political parties and how they're constantly evolving. And so it was basically, think about a graph that, it's like a plus sign, right? You got your Y and your X axis. And their argument was that the parties are always chasing each other around these axes. So on foreign policy and domestic policy, guns and butter or whatever else, social policy, fiscal policy, that as one party starts to lose people in the social area, the other one picks them up. And as the other party gains in fiscal conservatism, then the other one picks them up in either their social conservatism and the like. And what they were able to show essentially was that the modern day Republican Party has more in common with the Democratic Party of, say, 100, 150 years ago than the current Democratic Party does. And the opposite is true. So they're always chasing after these voters. And I think we're at a point in time right now where that's definitely occurring. Republicans are becoming slightly more blue collar than they had been in the 80s and 90s. Democrats are becoming slightly more white collar than they had been in the past. Republicans, I don't know. I mean, they some in the party seem to be trying to go after minority interests. They haven't been particularly successful at that, but I think you're going to see Republicans try to target for votes. I think they're going to try to go and appeal to the Hispanic community. Obviously, I think after 2012, Republicans, they had this vetting and decided they were going to try to double down on outreach to Hispanics. 2016 came around and Trump didn't quite, follow that agenda. Even still, though, if you look at the number of Hispanic voters that voted in favor of Trump, it was substantially higher than you might have expected. And I think, there's a cultural component to this that is bringing in more rural people to the Republican Party, that is bringing, many Hispanics in who are traditionally Catholic and a little bit more conservative in their views. So I'll be interested to see. I think we're at one of these moments where the parties are shifting, and it's not quite clear exactly where they're going to wind up.
In response to your question, somebody says Flight 93 seems to argue for a white America without immigrants governed by elites. A white America without immigrants governed by elites.
Yeah, I can certainly understand people saying that. I'm not sure about the white America. It's possible. If you go and you look at the end, so on page 1494 of the text, this author says, these policies will have the added benefit of lining the economic interests of, and we may hope fostering solidarity among the working, lower, middle, and middle classes of all races and ethnicities. So, if we want to be charitable to this author, and we don't have to be, but if we want to be, I think you could say, no, it's not about whiteness or blackness. It's about maybe maintaining the status quo or keeping with what we have right now. I think, he makes a lot of, I think, exaggerated claims about people who are coming here from countries that don't have experience with democracy and not having the background to understand what to do. I guess I don't think I agree with that, because, some of the most patriotic people that you can come across are those who have just earned their citizenship in this country, right? And so I'm not sure that I would go that far. I think it's certainly an exaggeration and an offensive one to many. But I think his concern is that, look, we're continually changing for the worse. Some could look at that as a racial aspect, and potentially maybe they're right. I don't know this person's politics very well. But it could be him just saying, look, Democrats are bringing people into the country that they're promising stuff to, and they're locking in a majority for themselves in the future. We've got to stop that from happening because it's cynical and sort of the wrong way to go. I think that's probably one element of it. The elitism thing, I think that's probably more of a stylistic matter than it is anything. It's kind of interesting that he's talking about, kind of blue collar Americans and traditional values and the like, and then he's tossing in Latin words left and right. There's a very sort of tone deaf element to this. I don't know how you can toss in this much Latin and then still think that it's going to appeal to like the average Joe. So I can certainly see where that elitism thing is coming in. I'm not sure that I think that the substance of what he's looking for is an elite America. But he certainly comes off as a smarmy sort of jackass, I guess. All this Latin.
There's one in here that says institutions, going back to your thing about Kirkians and institutions. Institutions are made of people. For example, 2.7 million federal civil servants. I feel the problem is the lack of shared human values. It's the problem, not the institutions. I mean, the example of universal rejections of violence that you mentioned is a start. Mm-hmm. The other problem, though, is the lack of shared acceptance of facts. So maybe it isn't the institutions, it's us. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, no, that's a heck of an insightful comment there. I don't know if you can say who that was, but whoever it was, congratulations. That's a great comment. I mean, look, this is something that we've actually talked about for centuries in this country now. Before the Constitution was even developed, we had this debate about what was more important, the people or the institutions. William Penn authored something, and he said, look, and this was well before we declared independence, if I'm not mistaken. And Penn said, look, it's not sufficient to have institutions, because if you have corrupt people or immoral people that get a hold of those institutions, they'll destroy them. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have moral people who are not uncorruptible, because we know that everybody is corruptible, but you have to have moral people at the helm, because that's the primary thing. Everything else will fall. Now, then you had other actors, other thinkers, I think James Madison chief among them, who certainly would articulate the need to have people who are moral in charge, but recognize nevertheless that institutions can protect us, can protect us from immoral people, not in perpetuity, to be sure, but can protect us against the occasional person. Now, in I believe it was the Federalist number 10, it could have been the 51. Madison said, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, and as a consequence of that, we have to diffuse power, right? So we have three branches, Congress is split into two, we've got federalism, all in an effort to make sure that if we do have the unenlightened statesman at the helm, that we can withstand it over time. And so I don't think that these are inseparable features. I think you have to have a culture that inculcates virtue, and this goes back to the Greeks. We have to have a culture that inculcates virtue among citizens, that allows them to recognize appropriate, inappropriate behavior, ways to accomplish change, and to be respectful of one another and empathetic to one another. And at the same time is built such that when we have these people who come into power, a demagogue or the like, that the institutions can disseminate that power, can channel it to the appropriate outcomes.
Do you think that Republicans can unite? And will it take uniting all three of these versions of Republicans in order to win a presidency again?
Well, I absolutely think they can unite. The thing about politics is we often think about politics in terms of what's going on right now. Could the party right now put forward a candidate who could win a presidential election at this moment in time? No, probably not. Probably not. The party is too divided internally. I think the brand has soured for many people. I think suburban female voters in particular have left the party, or at least stopped voting for the party in droves over the last 4 years. But having said that, it's much easier to unify when you are in the minority and you have a common enemy, so to speak. I think now that Joe Biden is about to be inaugurated here tomorrow, and once we see some of the policies he moves forward, I think Republicans will unite in their opposition to many of those policies. So nothing really brings people together, in the minority like this, as much as just opposition to what the other person is pursuing. So I think if Republicans are able to nominate people who can appeal not just to their base, but to some of these moderates that they've lost, either because of the policies that they're supporting or because of the policies they're opposing, I think the party will be okay. But what needs to happen, I think, is a discussion about what it is the party is for, much in line with, I think, Reagan's A Time for Choosing. He says about arguments that liberals make about the Republicans and conservatives. He says, it's not so much that our liberal friends are ignorant, it's that they know so much it isn't true. What I'd like to talk to you about is what we are for. And then he ticks off all of these elements. I think at some point, whoever is going to become the leader of the party is going to have to step forward and advocate for what they believe in. What does the party stand for? And I think, we'll have to see who that is, whether that's a Ted Cruz, whether it's a Ben Sasse, whether it's a Tom Cotton. It'll be, I think, incumbent on that person to identify the things that they stand for. And then we'll see what happens with people moving in that direction.
With the people being so looking at election results and thinking that they're so distorted when we have so many checks and balances and recounts, where do these Trump supporters who believe there's such fraud, do they fall under all three? Are they included in each three of these, or are they congealed into one under the gut? What do they do with this when the people who think there was fraud and we've had so much to prove that there wasn't?
Yeah, well, this is the really frustrating thing about our politics today is that if there's even a kernel of truth in something, it often gets blown way out of proportion, right? And I think you can take a look at some of the things that we've seen after this election. Was this election stolen? Was there so much corruption and fraud that it stole the election on behalf of Trump? No, it wasn't. And I think most Republicans would probably tell you no. Having said that, though, I think they would also tell you that there was a lot of stuff that happened here that just didn't look normal, right? I think the 2020 election, for better or worse, caught a lot of people with their pants down, just in terms of, the processes that we used, whether it's, absentee ballots, so-called ballot harvesting. There was a lot of it just didn't look normal, and to some people didn't look right. And frankly, there were many votes that were non-compliant. So if you take a look at Wisconsin here, there were many votes where people sent in their absentee ballots. They had a witness signature, but they didn't include the witness address. Now, those votes were counted. Was that corruption or fraud? No, not the way people think of it. Was it technically non-compliant with some of the statutes? Yeah, I guess it was. So, we're in that region where there were things that happened that people could point to, and if they want to kind of go off on a conspiracy theory with it, they could. And so, on the one hand, it's appropriate to say to some of those folks who are going off, on that approach, to say, look, no, it wasn't as you suggest it was. But then, at the other hand, say, look, but there were things that were just kind of weird this time around, and we got to look into it to make sure that things are appropriate and following the law. So, that's the long way around of just saying that with so many of the things that we have in politics today, there could be a kernel of something there, but then it just gets exaggerated, and then the exaggeration becomes the story, and then people can't get taken seriously. Then the issue isn't taken seriously, and pretty soon we're all arguing about nonsense. And so the hope is that we can actually have a legitimate understanding of what's going on, what's happened, and hopefully explain to people what they think happened didn't actually happen. The other thing I think that this illuminates, though, that I've noticed over the last few years is that Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals are actually seeing two very different worlds. Whether it's social media or just the natural congealing of news sources to one side versus the other. There are many people who, the only news that they hear, the only people they're talking to are 100% convinced that the election was stolen. And then there are folks on the other side who, all of their friends, all of the news sources that they get are telling them things about how there's just inherent structural racism everywhere and everything is about white supremacy. And that's not true either. So we have to figure out a way where people can be exposed to other viewpoints. We used to have this in society with people attending church or being part of trade organizations, having block parties, things like that. And as those cross-pollinating experiences have disappeared, it's become considerably easier for us to disassociate with the so-called other side. And as a consequence, we become very skeptical of arguments that those people say, in part because we don't know any of them. We know that when you're in personal physical contact with somebody, you have a connection with them, you become much more likely to trust them and work with them. And as that disappears, I think our politics is sort of a trailing indicator of that problem.
An attendee wonders about Paul Ryan. What kind of conservative is former House Speaker Paul Ryan? Based on this statement he gave when there were GOP legislators trying to overturn the results, Ryan said, "It is difficult to conceive of a more anti-democratic and anti-conservative act than a federal intervention to overturn the results of state-certified elections and disenfranchise millions of Americans. The fact that this effort will fail does not mean it will not do significant damage to us." Right. So there's a two-part question. One is what kind of conservative is he? And based on what Ryan just said, how much damage has been done to our country's institutions over the past 4 years?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would put him pretty squarely in that Reagan camp. I think his ideas, his policies were very much in that Reagan tradition, and I think that explains a lot about how he found himself in certain times, maybe the odd man out during Trump's presidency as the Speaker of a House. He was part of a faction that I think had been switched up at the time, so he found himself in a very awkward position. On a not insignificant number of issues. So that's where I would put him. Excuse me. And in terms of the institutional damage done, look, we'll see. I mean, one of the things that we've noticed over the last few years is that, even though liberty is always only one generation away from being gone, right? Many of the institutions that we've designed have been fairly resilient. The courts have been leaned on over the last few years. I think many of our institutions have stood up, and I think that's great. That's a testament to the founding fathers. I think federalism is something that we're going to hear more and more about. One of the things that we've noticed is that as Congress has been less able to do things based on gridlock or whatnot, states have really stepped up and started to do more. And I was talking to somebody the other day, and we were talking about the virtues of being in Congress these days. And I thought, my goodness, I would much rather be a player at the state level than a member of Congress right now, simply because you can get more done at the state level. I think there's a capacity to effectuate change there.
In the 1950s and 60s, Republicans denounced John Birchers. Does the party have a similar problem with right-wing extremists today? How will they deal with that?
Yeah, I think the party's people are gonna proceed cautiously, and this is what I was talking about earlier. I think it's important for people to articulate what they are for. What is it that Republicans stand for in this day and age? Is it lower taxes, limited government, individual dignity and responsibility, or is it something else? And I think we have to see that play out. I think the party would probably benefit. I am quite confident that the party would benefit from someone who could stand up and articulate a positive message about what the party is and what it stands for. Now, having said that, I don't think that we can avoid the fact that many conservatives are just, it's not just that they're angry, right? They're very worried. And they're worried, I think, because they see the institutions that we've been talking about from their perspective being taken over by the left. So whether it's the media, corporate America these days, K-12 education, universities, I think they see them as being taken over by the left in much the way that I think the Flight 93 author talks about. But they don't know yet how to change that, what to do about it. So I think a Republican candidate who could come out and speak to that notion and say, look, yes, I understand your perspective. You think that these institutions have been co-opted and commandeered. That's why you need to vote for us to get us in those positions. A person who can do that, I think, can be successful and at the same time not trash the institutions that have lasted for a long time. So I think that could be a message that could appeal to a lot of different people in a positive capacity.
Given the success of down ballot Republicans in this large turnout, do you think Republicans, Democrats could agree on making voting easier as opposed to things that are happening with gerrymandering and reaction being to suppress votes by maybe having different the way the ballots and things are counted, you end up suppressing votes. So could Dems and Republicans agree on ways to make it easier rather than harder?
Well, I think so, but I'm not sure that easy is the right word to use. Secure is probably not the right word to use because that for some that might have connotations. I think that there is definitely room for Democrats and Republicans to examine some of the things that happened with mail-in ballots, with things like that, to figure out how can we permit this to continue while still respecting the sanctity and security of votes. It's interesting when you hear conservatives and liberals talk about this. Liberals talk about how Republicans don't appreciate how important voting is, and we've got to make it easier for people to vote. And then Republicans and conservatives in response will say, we do. It's because we believe so strongly in the right to vote, the sanctity of voting, that we want to keep it secure. So, I mean, some of them on each side may be just kind of, using that as a shibboleth. But I suspect that each side very much agrees or believes in what they're saying here. So it's not so much, or perhaps it's not so much a disagreement over whether voting is important. It's just how to get more voting while maintaining security in it. I think that will be the debate that we'll see over the next couple of years. And I suspect that there will be some bipartisan work that can be done on it. I know Devin LeMahieu here in the state has talked a little bit about looking into, if I'm not mistaken, some of the indefinitely confined voters and what we can do to address them. I suspect there might be some bipartisan analysis that could be done there. It's also quite possible that Republicans and Democrats could come together in terms of campaign finance on these issues. So many people received multiple rounds of absentee ballot applications that were not always solicited by them, but sent to them by outside groups. And that's permissible under state law. I mean, groups can find out who voted in the past and then mail them application requests. People may want to know who's paying for those things. And that could be something that Republicans and Democrats work on together. We'll just have to see.
So is there any chance of getting to a common agreement about what truth is? How can we govern a country and negotiate solutions when we can't agree on what's real?
Yeah, it is a foundational problem. And even in the classroom, we have these discussions sometimes when a student will speak up and say, well, this is my truth. I have to say, well, no, there's no such thing as your truth. There's the truth, and then your perspective on the truth, right? But this is kind of where the language has gone in recent years, my truth and his truth or her truth. It suggests that we don't have a underlying conception of truth and facts, as you will. Again, I'm going to both sidesism this one, but I think it's quite clear that both sides have engaged in alternative facts for years now, and that's a problem. But when we come back to this, I mean that's why I think some of the discussions that we're having today about the country and about our history are so divisive because I think it's a question about who we are, right? I mean, we used to have arguments about, all right, well, within these boundaries, here are the policy disputes that we're going to have. It's now not quite so much about those policy disputes within the boundaries as much as it is about the boundaries themselves. And so it's really a kind of a redefining era right now. And I think the point is very well taken. Just if we don't have any underlying agreement about who we are, what we stand for, or the truth, we're in a hell of a lot of trouble.
How long will Trumpism last without President Trump?
It's a good question. It depends, I think, on what happens to him. If I think, obviously he's been impeached by the House again. If there are removal proceedings, which I don't expect to happen, if they were going to happen, I believe they would have happened now. But let's just say that the Senate then decides to move towards removal and then conviction, after President Biden takes office. There's a likelihood, some have advocated that there's a likelihood that could make him a martyr and then kind of keep him more popular among the base. So it's unclear. It just depends on what happens on his way out. I think it happens on, whether he still has a platform on Twitter, the like. It's interesting. I think there are a lot of people who would say, actually, Senate Republicans who are thinking about, trying to run for office for president in 4 years, they may want to see him get convicted so that he can't run again, because that clears the path for them. However, I don't think they want to be the ones who cast those votes, because that would alienate their base quite a bit. So, it's difficult to say which direction it's going to go. And again, I think a lot of it, my dogs are about to bark here momentarily, by the way. I think, and there they go. So I think it depends on how he leaves office. But I think his low approval rating right now is not going to endear himself to a lot of the party leadership.
Someone's observing on your XY axis with Dems and Republicans attracting the opposites, each other, polar opposites. Doesn't this dynamic emphasize that you actually continue to go to the extremes of each side instead of to the middle and toward consensus? I mean, how does that work rather than carving out extreme niches to build your base?
Yeah, so it is a reaction to where the other party goes. So as one party perhaps becomes more extreme, if you will, on one dimension, the other party tries to pick up those voters in the middle. And so, if you have a Republican Party that has been, for example, about free trade and tax cuts for a very long time, and there's some opportunity for an opening there. Maybe Democrats try to take a shot at that, or maybe as Democrats become more liberal on one dimension, they open themselves up on a different dimension. And that's actually what I think we're seeing these days. As liberals are becoming more progressive on cultural and social issues, I think their voters who have traditionally been, blue collar workers, they are, a lot of them are living in areas that are a little bit more culturally conservative, and I think they get ripe for pickoff. So part of this is kind of the issue dimension that's relevant, and I don't know how you make an issue more or less relevant. I don't think that parties can actually do that intentionally. Sometimes they can, but a lot of times it's a reaction to something else. But the old Democratic coalition was a lot of laborers and built into that coalition. And as the louder part of that coalition becomes more culturally liberal, I think the people who are less culturally liberal are ripe for the taking, and that happens to be blue collar workers right now. So as the Republican Party picks up more of those blue collar workers, they're actually picking up some of those blue collar workers' economic beliefs as well, and that's influencing the party. So it's just this constant mixture and back and forth. And absolutely, as one party goes further extreme, I think they're ripe to be picked off. And I think as our politics is becoming more extreme over time, I think there are people who are going to be ripe to be picked off among the voters in the middle.
So someone's observing that, of course, your idea, the thing about our news sources and where do we get it? We don't, and what you said, basically like bowling alone. And we don't all sit around and watch the last episode of MASH or catch Walter Cronkite, right, or what happened with Dallas in the Dallas series. And the local news is disintegrating. What do you tell two questions here. What news source do you believe is credible? What do you tell your students about where and how to consume news?
Well, I try not to tell my students where and how to consume their news. I can point out to them that all of these news sources have their own biases, and then hopefully they'll make their own decisions as adults. I think a good thing to do, of course, is just to look at multiple news sources. Whether you're looking at Fox and then you go to CNN or the Wall Street Journal and then the New York Times, I think it's important to have at least some resource out there that doesn't say what you want to hear all the time. I think that's probably just a good thing to have in life in general, right? You don't be surrounded by yes men or yes women. And we know that groupthink has its tremendous problems with what it can do. It can certainly lead to barbarity at the worst, but certainly ignorance in the least. So just a multitude, I think, of resources is good to look to. Now, having said that, I think having a multitude of resources is actually a good thing, for the same reason that I think federalism is a good thing, that if you have one entity or a very small handful of entities that are controlling the news, they have a lot of power there to stamp out news that they don't want to air. And so I do think it's, on a whole, I think it's probably good that we have more news sources today than we had in the past. But I think it's also important for people to sort of spice it up, so to speak, to diversify their portfolio. If we can take some of the advertisements, right, to diversify the news that they're hearing so that they can sort of challenge their own thoughts a little bit. It's hard. I mean, nobody wants it. I mean, you don't want to hear that you're wrong.
Yeah, I was an old journalism professor for a long time. And I always told him about Eric Sevareid when he signed off. He said, it's your job to be a good consumer of the news. Just like you take a sweater back that had a wrong button, you take it back to the store and you say, hey, where did you get, what happened here? And that you need to be a good consumer of the news. And he said specifically, you don't just watch, I think Severide was NBC, I think. And he said, you got to watch at the time, CBS, you got to watch all of his competitors. But
Right.
Severide was on certainly on top of that too.
Yeah.
So in the current Wisconsin legislature, which of the three factions do you believe is dominant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm going to demur on that one. It's tough to say. I think there are elements of all of them in there, and so
Is one more dominant though? Would you say?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I honestly, I know I'm taking the easy way out on this one, but
Well, I think it's certainly with Fitzgerald gone. I think there's certainly a difference in the Senate at this point in terms of how things have happened a little bit. Anyway, just an observation there. Someone's asking you for your crystal ball. Are there 17 GOP senators to convict?
If this was a month ago, I'd say the answer could be yes. But given the fact that he's out the door tomorrow, that the president is done tomorrow, I suspect that there won't be, unless there is evidence that comes out that maybe this was more organized or something like that. If there was evidence that came out to suggest that that this was a planned thing by the president or something like that, then I think you could see those numbers. At this point, though, just given the timing, I suspect that people will say, you know what, he's done, just move on. Again, I'm not saying that's the right thing or the wrong thing, but that would be my prediction.
Yeah, which of course makes it clear that the longer you do wait, there could be the opportunity to find more things that could persuade people.
Well, I think that's right. But, on the other hand, too, I think it's going to be difficult for President Biden because for the media, President Trump has been the gift that keeps on giving. They report him like crazy, and there's always something for them to report on. And so I think they're going to want to continue this after Trump is out of office. On the other hand, Biden, I think for his own political purposes, wants to get past the moment. He wants the attention to be on his policies and what he's going to do. So I think there's going to be a strong element from his side to say, no, just shut this down because it's about me now and what we're going to do moving forward. So I'll be interested to see how that plays out, because Nancy Pelosi has already indicated that she wants to push this hard. Chuck Schumer has indicated that he may want to push it. And Biden has been out there kind of saying, I don't think that we maybe want to do this so much. So that'll be an internal discussion they have to have in that party.
Do you think McConnell is all about pure power as opposed to the philosopher type of Kirkian and other things we talked about?
Boy, I think it's interesting when we read the philosophers and the ideologies. Everybody has an ideology until their ideology is sort of uncomfortable. And then they make changes to try to win elections or to achieve the best policy that they think they can. So one of the things American politicians have always been, for better or for worse, I suppose, is pragmatic. And I think that's actually been a feature of American political thinking for a long time as well, is just pragmatism. When you compare a lot of our politicians to political actors in other countries, they are considerably more ideological elsewhere. Now, that may be changing, of course, here, but there's a degree of pragmatism, I think, that comes into our politics. So, even Reagan, who was ideologically very strongly in favor of balanced budgets and limited government, of course, we know what happened to the budget there. Lyndon Johnson, similar issues. So people come into office with these ideas and expectations, and I guess our hope as voters is that they come as close to achieving those things as they possibly can, but they rarely do everything.
Mm-hmm. Question about the throwing out the electoral votes of Arizona and Pennsylvania. Were the people who voted that way, like Fitzgerald, Tiffany, do you think they really believed they should have been thrown out, or they knew they could do it knowing that they wouldn't win?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I'd have to say you probably need to talk to them about it. I can't get inside their minds and tell you what they were thinking when they did it. I know that they probably sincerely had questions about what happened. They're worried about election integrity. But beyond that, I probably couldn't speak for them on that.
More crystal ball. Ron Johnson running again. Question. Governor, who might be Republican nominee for governor? Question. You got your crystal ball out on a few things for us?
Yeah, well, I think so. With Senator Johnson, that's a tough one. You talk to people who are close to him, and they say, "Look, we don't even know what he's planning on doing. We could see him saying, to hell with all of you and retiring, or he could say, to hell with all of you, I'm going to stay in this and push it as hard as I can." Nobody really knows for sure. With governor, that'll be an interesting race. I think it'll be, obviously everybody's trying to figure out what Tony Evers is going to do. There are a lot of people who think that he won't run for re-election. At first, I didn't think that was going to be the case. I thought he would stick around. I'm not quite so convinced of that now. I think he may leave. And of course, if he does, then I suspect that Josh Kaul will run for that position. On the Republican side, I think there are a lot of really good candidates as well. Rebecca Clayfish is clearly laying the foundation. She's out hustling, really working really hard. So I think she obviously comes in as the front runner. But then there are other candidates who are doing some work, I think, as well. I've heard that Bill McCoshen is thinking about it, former Tommy Thompson guy. Yeah. There are others. I mean, we don't know where Kevin Nicholson, where his thinking is on things right now. He obviously wants to run for a statewide office. It's not clear whether that's senator or governor. But I think all three of those, and then some others as well. I think all three of those would make for very interesting candidates and could appeal to a lot of people in the party. And again, it'll be the message they advocate, the kind of policies they're trying to pursue.
And this will be the last questions because I know you've got to run and we appreciate your time. Whose bench is deeper? Republican bench, sounds like you're saying the Republican bench for governor at least is a lot deeper than Dem bench.
Well, I don't know for sure that that's the case. I think, obviously with Republicans having been in control of state government for as long as they have, I think they just have a deeper bench just simply by the numbers of what we know about some of them. But that's not to say that a Democratic candidate couldn't emerge that we haven't been thinking about right now and lodge an argument about being an outsider. So we'll just see what happens with it. I think clearly we've got some. I think the lieutenant governor will probably run for governor if there's a vacancy there. So that would be an interesting primary to keep our eyes on. But yeah, I think 2022 will be a very interesting year. It'll be a defining year for Republicans, certainly in Wisconsin. I think the landscape probably favors them simply because it's a midterm with a Democratic incumbent president. And we know that the out party in midterm elections over the last couple of decades have done particularly well. So we'll just see what happens in 2022.
Dennis, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Okay.
Well, Ryan, thanks very much. A lot of thinking that we can kind of continue with and to chew on. A lot of really great perspective, and we really appreciate the time that you spend with us. So,
well, I appreciate that, and again, the one thing that I certainly, just on a personal level, would like to see is for people to tone down the rhetoric a little bit. I think it's fair game for us all to disagree with one another on policies, and we all have our own political and policy views, and I think it's right to fight like crazy for your policy positions. At the end of the day, I hope that we can find a good outlet for those beliefs and whatever desires, angers, motivations we have. Run for office, get elected, change people in power. But I think our institutions are important. We got to keep them, change them where necessary. But I'm hopeful that we can tone down that rhetoric and move together in an optimistic fashion.
I agree. Yeah. And both get the pandemic over as well as follow what you're saying and have more hugs and handshakes. That's what we need.
Nice.
All right.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it. And those were great questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So Terry, do we have?
I think the question, I think I got through most of them. The only one I came in at the very end was about asking his opinion on the Electoral College. But I think we're okay on that, on his presentation and what we have at that point. So if you wanted, Dennis, in the last, 20 minutes, I'm sure there'll be questions for you from folks about what's going on, what happened in the last week, and your own observations about, where we stand with some of these. You can wade in wherever you want, I think.
Sure. Yeah, and of course we can, nothing wrong with ending early if that's what people would prefer to do. Get out and enjoy the weather. Yeah, but I think that one of the things that I think comes through as Ryan talks about the three different kind of philosophies within the Republican Party, and even that he would admit is a kind of a simplification, is the issue of political leadership, which I think really has to be stressed. We can all remember a time when things were much more civil, when, as Ryan was kind of signing off, he sort of encouraged us to get to a point where we could have disagreements on philosophy, disagreements on policy, and yet still respect one another and talk and act civilly. And boy, the mob action at the Capitol kind of really makes that point very, very, very much. And I think that's an important kind of issue. You can identify specific individuals, both at the state level as well as at the federal level, who have made a choice about what kind of a leader they're going to be. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, have made choices about being a leader that is primarily interested in power per se, not necessarily philosophy, and that they're going to be a polarizing leader and treat compromise as if it's a dirty four-letter word. And that's unfortunate. The other observation I would make, and there are a number of, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Terry, too, is, a lot of times when we have a discussion like this, we sort of say, well, both sides, as if there are only two sides, both sides are doing this. And so you kind of almost slough things off as it's both sides. And we often say, oh, all of the media is biased. The media is inherently biased. And I don't feel comfortable with that personally. I don't think that you can say that the media is biased no matter what the source of media is. I think that as a consumer, that one of the things we have to do is recognize the difference between bias and facts. And there are times when adjectives are used. Okay, maybe that is indeed done in a way to get us to have a certain interpretation of what's going on. But facts can be verified. You can find out. I mean, I think of the debates that we had on welfare reform and during the Reagan years. And Reagan was famous for describing the welfare queens and people who were poor, and it was their fault, and they were trying to scam the system and all of that sort of stuff. Well, these were all anecdotes. A lot of them were made up, and they're verifiable. And indeed, one of the contributions of the Poverty Institute at Wisconsin and the La Follette School at Wisconsin was to try and get the facts. Okay, how many people are migrating from Illinois to Wisconsin because Wisconsin has higher welfare benefits? And do we indeed have higher welfare benefits? Well, those are things that you can pursue. Those are things that you can indeed confirm one way or another. And that's different than if you basically say, well, I think welfare is a bad thing. That's a statement of bias. Perhaps it's just a general conclusion, but what are you basing it on? And frankly, the issue of voting security versus voting access. Voting security has been thrown up by people who want to constrain the vote rather than allow people to vote for decades. You think about the famous Bush v. Gore controversy and the changes that were made at the federal and state levels in the aftermath of that. And it was all, when you really think about it, it was not so much access to the vote, to the ballot box. It was all sorts of obstacles, all sorts of issues of security. And there was no issue of security. It wasn't an issue of fraud in the 2000 election. It was an issue of voting administration. It was an issue of how the ballots were constructed, things like that. So I think that we, as consumers, we really ought to be pushing for the facts and getting things that we can confirm and verify. And I mean, one of my favorite news sources is public radio. And one of my favorite peeves, if you will, I guess that's a contradiction in terms, but one of the things that I really don't like about public radio is they have some reporters who, and maybe this is sort of taught in journalism school, where their story is based on kind of random interviews of people in the street. And on the one hand, it's kind of interesting to hear these people talk about their own personal experience, but that's not facts. That's not something that we can kind of take and generalize and say, okay, everybody's experiencing this, or this is how everybody feels. And I think that's where we really need to be more probing as consumers. And I would love to see journalists kind of either label a story, an anecdote as an anecdote and a story so we can have a good perspective on it, or just not do that and base their stories more on what has happened, what are the facts.
Well, those are, you're talking about having some good editors too, editors who know how to assign and what to ask for and what they're looking for. So you don't just have anecdotes, what we used to call stacking quotes. Stacking quotes doesn't make a story true. And so you just think of stacking quotes. No, you've got to have something. I think our questioners today, all of our audience participants, were some fantastic, sharp and pointed questions.
Oh, very good.
And it made me think of the article in the State Journal about your colleague Ken Meyer from 2 years ago or 3 years ago being chastised for theoretically being anti-Trump and saying that, but it's what he does for every president class he teaches, and listening to Ryan, who is also teaching at poli-sci and political science, and just thinking about that, your own experiences with that, Dennis. I mean, how did you keep it? I assume you kept it neutral the way you keep this neutral. You just don't go down the middle and you say where it is, where things fall.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, when you're having interactions with students and with other faculty members or members of the public, is indeed just sort of being probing and being challenging, and not just accepting somebody's statement as if it's true when there isn't any, either there isn't anything backing it up, or they're saying something that you can't verify one way or another, and trying to get people to be critical as they're thinking. Critical meaning that they're careful, logical, and evidence-based. And one of the major negative legacies, of course, of the Trump presidency is just not having any kind of value placed on facts. The lies that Trump told so he could try and create his own reality, but also just discarding and disregarding facts as they came out of the COVID experience or other kinds of things too.
Yeah. So somebody had two observations. They thought that Ryan didn't do, really sort of sloughed off the question about Mitch McConnell, and also that he used the term alternative facts himself with that. So we also have a question, that was just an observation, and then questions about what kind of things are coming up in the future that people want to know they should tune in for.
I think a major question about the future is how the Senate is going to be operating. Who's going to be chair of the various committees, and we're having kind of an experiment with more equal kind of representation. I think that's that could be a move that allows us to have more deliberative and careful and compromising kinds of deliberations. It could also be one where we end up having people yelling at each other and nothing gets done. But I think that that's an experiment in a way that really ought to go forward, and we ought to be looking at that and seeing what happens with Mitch McConnell and the kind of leadership he's providing. I mean, he's basically, some would say his leadership has been rather selective, that in some areas like judicial appointments and confirmation, it's been very forceful, very direct, and he's sort of pulled out all the stops. In other areas, it's been non-existent. We don't know where he's encouraging the Republican caucus to go. He's not really providing much leadership there at all. You could make that kind of an observation on the whole idea of convicting Trump, given the impeachment in the House. Mitch McConnell is basically saying, well, vote the way you want to vote. So is that an example of no leadership? Or is that an example of, okay, this is a time when you really do need to examine your conscience and think about the people that you represent, think about what kind of a leader you as a senator want to be. There are different ways of going with that. So a lot of questions. I think it's going to be a very interesting, 2 years until we have the next Senate elections. And Ryan was pointing out that usually, almost always, the party that controls the White House doesn't do well in the midterm elections. And while that is indeed the case, that's not always the case historically. And I think that a lot of the issues regarding voting and voter turnout, that's the real issue. No presidential coattails is the main dynamic when you have a midterm election. So we'll see.
And then the last one here is, so what else are we doing with Wither the State? What are some other topics coming up?
Well, we are in a jump ahead to the conclusion. We have our last two sessions are going to be on gerrymandering, and that'll be really interesting. And in between, we've been talking about a number of issues. We haven't got it all nailed down yet. And if people have got ideas, please let us know. But we've been talking about transportation policy as an issue that's got a number of different dynamics. Some people have really enjoyed the discussions on the economics and economic policy, and we've talked about pursuing that, trying to answer the question of why is the stock market behaving in a way that doesn't seem to reflect the general health of the economy. That's a question that some people have raised, and that's something that we might be able to pursue too. So we'll guarantee you some good, interesting topics.
That sounds good. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the last one we have on here, Dennis. So I'll let you say the goodbyes.
Okay. Yeah. And thanks again, Terry, for your wonderful job in moderating. That's really useful. And thanks for all of the contributions, Kurt, in terms of URLs and the like that we can pursue. So.
Okay. And thank you, Dennis, for setting that up. All right.
Okay.
So long, everybody.
Bye now.